This video will show how the British created the Mfecane to hide their use of witchcraft and witch doctors. We will call them witch doctors in this video because witch hunters do the same thing, but make it sound different. The British used witches to attain their goal of stealing gold from southern Africa. They would later rename and call the land Matebeleland to justify their invasion and hand it over to their mercenary, whom they crowned a British king, because Gazi was a British king and not an African one. Robert Moffat and the so-called missionaries of the London Missionary Society were political and intelligence agents under the directors of the London Missionary Society. Their goal was to find the gold that was hidden and steal it, in what they would later call Matebeleland. They used Gazi, their mercenary, to claim the region on behalf of the British and appointed him a king. No African, like we say before, had ever named Gazi a king. No one, just like Shaga before him. Gazi was a British king. The British specialized at appointing kings in Africa to justify the thefts of the land, resources, and human labor they were stealing, while rewarding their installations with trinkets. But unfortunately for the British, Gazi's appointment did not succeed, and it is one reason why Matebeleland is still in hardship, because Gazi and his heirs could not become kings unless they took the form of the murdered Proto-Bantu king, which he did try to do, and it did not work out. On the advice of the British and his witches, Gazi took the murdered king's skin, yes, that's his skin, and his heart, and he boiled the heart and wore the skin as a cloak. And unfortunately for Gazi, the skin got stuck to his skin, and he died in 1838, not 1868. This is the story that is whispered across Matebeleland. This is the real story of what happened in Southern Africa. African history is where the first guardians remind us we're all just human. And the British, like the Portuguese before them and the Arabs before them, learned this lesson the hard way. But in case you feel the need to doubt this narrative, remember that the missionaries were men like John Campbell who fashioned themselves holy men. He also gave the Coloureds their new name Griqua in 1812, which he appropriated from a group out of what was then the Namakwa region. The name Griqua was meant to make the Coloureds more presentable and empathetic, a far cry from their previous name, which was Bastards. Yes, that Bastards. British men like John Campbell came to Africa and used witchcraft to attain their goals. While in Africa, they were always on the lookout for rainmakers. They wanted true rainmakers who could only be found by the Haga, or witch doctors. Rainmakers, or the Haga, usually hide themselves and refuse to be found, just like the ancient Proto-Bantu kingdom, which all use the same first science. They can only be revealed by a witch because witches are the ones who tell. If you think this is far-fetched and that Europeans did not use witchcraft when in Africa, please remember that the Portuguese used witches to accompany their warlords, and here's a direct quote from Barreto. The Portuguese had an African witch on their side, but prior to the battle she changed sides, and while scattering her magic powder, a field piece was directed at her, and she was scattered by it to the winds. This witch lady was the first person the Portuguese targeted and murdered during this war, and it was done in order to stop her from succeeding against them. Otherwise, she wouldn't have been so important unless they knew that what she did worked, and it was in their best interest to end it as soon as possible. Upon seeing this, the Portuguese warlord placed a likely gold-stolen collar from his neck and put it around his gunner's neck. Their priests were now the keeper of the keys to the enslaved people's towers, so they were very useless and had been traded for witches. But in order to get this far, the Portuguese were head deep in cow dung and blood sacrifices, because anyone that knows anything about African witchcraft knows the Haina riders are on another level with their humiliation rituals, and they always demand payments, which always come by way of humiliation. This is why the use of African witchcraft is usually swept under the rug. No one wants to talk about it, because it is humiliating. And what they were using in Africa was witchcraft, not rainmaking or Haga. It is important to discern the three. The Haga Manga are the oldest practitioners of the first science. They are tethered to and by the old guardian spirits. Once a person is tethered to the old guardian spirits, they can only go up to the stars. They don't live on our earthly plane anymore, but can be called to protect us and uplift us. The Rainmakers can engage with both the guardians and the humans, but if they become corrupted, they lose their tether to the guardians. The witches are called Mulozi or Muloi, and these are spiritual school dropouts and scavengers who never fail to create monsters. They're the lowest level of law and aren't above getting what they want in any way. They go as far as burying their bodies alive until their bodies turn into maggots and have their wives reheap them so that they can come back to life. This really happens. So the difference between a witch or a Haga and a rainmaker is the individual's ability to work without a tool and part water. Witches can't do any of that without accessories. This is because witches love using animal byproducts like bones, blood, organic matter, and inorganic matter. They're always scavenging and looking to embody another thing's energy. That's why they don't create anything from within. They always look from outside and then adopt and embody that thing's essence and become more powerful. Being a great rainmaker or Haga isn't being a witch. The Haga are those who can split water. So remember the story about Moses splitting the Red Sea. We have a fairy tale about a princess who splits the water for her lover. That deserves a video of its own, and this is an old story. So how did the British become entangled with fallen African spiritual school dropouts? The British became involved in African witchcraft due to greed. They had to find a witch doctor to help them locate the fabled gold mines of the Proto-Bantu region, which was northwest of Great Zimbabwe but remained a mystery and unseen to many people. This meant that only a few people, specifically rainmakers, understood how to find it. This would not be the last time the British would enlist an African witch doctor. They would do so again in the late 1890s when they would enlist a Shona witch doctor to help them find the location of the Ndebele rainmaker who was in the mountains. Once they found him, the British won this war, otherwise they were losing. But they will probably have a very different story until you leave them in the middle of the African bush begging for lion invisibility powder. Between 1806 and 1854 BC, the British were simply in their broke era. They were poor traders who sold only beads and only had access to poorly designed embroidery beads. But they also had a vision, for they had heard of the fabled gold mines located in what they would later call Matebeleland, a place where only British prospectors would be allowed mining rights after 1838. This was where they were eager to gain their resources at any cost, and they did. But before they could steal this land and these resources, they faced the same problem others had before them. No one knew where to find this land or the gold. They wanted not just gold dust, but the Mapungubwe rhinoceros type of gold, the one that had been refined and processed. That's the gold the British wanted. And they collected the data and found that the best way to find these gold-filled lands was to find the Rainmakers, who were at this time in rotation, meaning that they were switched and moved from one town or district to another in some places. This rotation made it easy for some of them to become corrupted and sell the information to the British. The gold mines in southern Africa were mostly hidden, and this was part of the first science, which was called Guvuna, which means to be hidden. The Haga used this skill to protect the Proto-Bantu. It was especially useful when it came to protecting them from lions, which were plenty in that region. This first science allowed people to walk through lion-infested regions without being harmed, and they often took their many heads of cattle, numbering over 10,000, and the lions would not see them. This is when we can tell that the Africans in that region were native or not to that region, because the people that were not native to that region often had a harder time with lion and hyena attacks because they did not know this first science and they did not practice it. This first science has been reduced to nothingness by Europeans and religious fanatics and people not native to Africa, but I think we know the Portuguese would most likely tell us who would fare better. When it comes to gold production, an overlooked fact is that the Great Zimbabwe region was not producing gold anymore. It hadn't produced gold for a long time, most likely during the last true Mwene Mutapa's empire. Mwene Mutapa's title was appropriated and used by people who were not the Mongas. The Mongas were warriors guarding the Lupata Mountains, down to the Zambezi to the Indian Ocean. Only the people who were part of the Mongas were the rightful Mutapas. And before 1838, there were no undeveloped people in this region, and Matebeleland did not exist. This was brought in by the British. This region was part of the Himanansa capital of the Proto-Bantu, who knew where to find the gold mines and where to mine the gold. These were the same people as the Mongas, which is often misspelled as Manga, who fought the Portuguese along the Zambezi but lost that land to the Portuguese and Muzimba. The Portuguese never won these battles alone. They always hired African mercenaries to help them. So this battle between the Mongas and the Portuguese was not fought between the Mongas and the Portuguese alone. The Portuguese had allies, and these were the mercenaries, like Muzimba. So the gold that came to Great Zimbabwe after the true Proto-Bantu Monga, Mwene Mutapa, came from the northwest, which was the capital of the Proto-Bantu. Great Zimbabwe had since taken the role of a fairground since that first Arab invasion. There was no gold produced out of Great Zimbabwe from 1100 BC or AD onward. The London Missionary Society started sending their agents in approximately 1812 to search for this fabled land of gold. In 1812 they sent John Campbell, and they must have sent someone before that. We still have to look into that. But in 1816, Robert Moffat followed John Campbell's footsteps and traveled as far north into the Lake Ngami area, collecting data about the people in this region, which means nothing if you believe the missionary story. These political and intelligence agents were masquerading as holy men, collecting data from the Lake Ngami area, which was the one place where the Proto-Bantu brought their cows to graze. These cow grazing camps were common around southern Africa and often involved young men taking cows up to graze and then bringing them back. The data the British collected allowed them to pinpoint the location of these fabled gold lands. The British were unable to afford gold, but they used tobacco and alcohol to sway the market. They used it so much that some Africans would become addicted to tobacco and alcohol, and in doing so would readily give up information regarding the gold. It is important to point out that a lot of the new populations wore primarily animal skins as their primary way of dress. These weren't the original populations, and these are evident in the cultural changes experienced during this period. The Proto-Bantu went from making strong clay earthenware, baskets, fishing baskets, wood and ironwork, and goldwork, to very poor or non-existent in these skills. This is a quote regarding one of the Proto-Bantu homes by the time that they had already been invaded. In some houses, there were figures, pillar and carved or molded in hard clay, and painted with different colors. They were indeed ingenious people. We saw among them various vessels formed of clay, painted of different colors and glazed for holding water, milk, food, and a kind of beer made from corn. This is what we call Chiwantu or Wuchwala. They also had pots of clay of all sizes and very strong. Every part of their houses and yards was kept very clean. They smelted both copper and iron. The Rainmaker took us to see one furnace in which they smelted iron. It was built of clay, almost equal parts in hardness to stone. They also wore white cotton or linen cloth or went naked. This area was in Guli, which is one of the few surviving districts with a large Proto-Bantu population. It was located in what would become the Northwest Province in modern-day South Africa, and it was destroyed by the Mfecane mercenaries in 1820, less than a year after John Campbell, the London Missionary Society agent, had visited and made plans for it without the owners knowing. Robert Moffat then visited their ruins a few months after he had set Musirikazi on them. All of this destruction was meant to help them find the location of these fabled gold lands. The British had a high interest in finding any and all the Rainmakers, and they sought them out wherever they could find them, and their biggest pet peeve were fake Rainmakers. Whenever they met a Rainmaker, they would challenge them to display their skills, which is a very curious thing to do if you don't believe in the entire thing. But they weren't competing with Jesus. They were just trying to figure out who could actually make things happen. The Proto-Bantu also understood astrology, which was being practiced at Great Zimbabwe. These were people who understood how to use sound to lift objects, something modern humans are still figuring out. In addition to astrology, they also understood how to mine and refine gold. And the gold was embedded in the floors of their stone ruins. It is all gone now, but they also weaved cloth with gold, and we know this because the Mutapa only wore cloth manufactured in the interior, which shows they were weaving cloth and dyeing cloth. So, when we see people wearing animal skins, we have to ask, where did this come from? The idea that Africa is a dark continent in a savage state in need of rescuing and civilizing was an Arab and then European design meant to hide what they had to do to steal from Africa. They targeted Rainmakers, in the case of the British, who were murdered. If these people were nothing more than charlatans, why were they being taken so seriously unless they could do more than they explained? The Rainmakers were very important individuals who knew how to find the Proto-Bantu, because that's one of the few ways they could be found. The British were known to meet with informants from the interior. One such meeting was reported by John Campbell as a meeting between Moffat and a very important guest from the interior, most likely somebody that was addicted to tobacco and alcohol. But Moffat's record of this meeting is missing from his official narrative. The person the British used to reveal the location of the Proto-Bantu was a witch. This person used the sap of a tree rubbed on the eyes of the people who wanted to see what was hidden, to reveal everything that was hidden, which is one reason the attack happened so fast for the Proto-Bantu, and it had devastating effects. They weren't ready at all. Prior to the attack, the Matebele were able to see human activity such as sandals, footprints, and cow hooves, which would shortly disappear going into nowhere. When they applied the sap of this tree, they were able to see everyone, and the killing began. Mziligazi found the king's court and murdered him. He took his heart and his skin. Mziligazi's witches had told him that he should wear the skin so he would embody the man. This was common practice among some of these cannibal groups, like Mziligazi and Shaga to some extent. They had a practice of boiling the human remains of the people they had murdered and used them for drink or to energize their spears. The point was for them to embody the essence of the person in the same way that it works to eat an animal that you want to be like. It is also important to remember that Moffat sent Mziligazi to this region, although Moffat never confirms or attaches himself to any of this stuff. But it is well known that Moffat had many undocumented visits to this region, and it was Moffat that sent the witch doctor to give Mziligazi the tree sap. So I hope you can now see how problematic this would be to explain the origins of this sudden wealth and land to their Christian audience. To explain that these so-called people of God were playing witch doctor, committed genocide, and attempted to replace the original population with one of their choosing that would do whatever they wanted. And their star agent was going around Africa calling himself the greatest rainmaker, the king of Kuruman. And talking about Kuruman Mission was the headquarters for the London Missionary Society, and it was no accident that it was built near Proto-Bantu Waygate. Our origin stories teach us that people use these jundu or waygates to travel, which is why we are called Vana va Jundu. Jundu is a peak or a big rock or mountain. These rocks often had footprints, and they are present near Kuruman, in Zimbabwe, and the Kariba Dam areas, just to name a few locations. At Inyanga in Zimbabwe, which was part of the Eastern Proto-Bantu Kingdom, the home of the first Batonga, this place was unfortunately called the Gate to Hell by the Portuguese because they feared the gods their priests found but wanted to pray to. Inyanga has now got alien abduction stories, so if you're interested in that, it's a fun read. In order to cover up their tracks, the British made it their business to also collect any items that might still belong to the Proto-Bantu, and they recorded that they collected some clay pots after the Shona Karanga complained about hearing people they could not see. These clay pots were signposts to the waygates and are currently in British possession. If they weren't that important, then why did they take them? To erase the presence of the Proto-Bantu in Zimbabwe, the British also engaged in making up African history and did a lazy job of it. They simply renamed Mziligazi's capitals after Shaga and got the meanings wrong. For example, Shaga's first capital was Jibigogo, which means something very terrible happened here. Now, apparently, Mziligazi had the same inspiration and named his own capital Jibigogo, and then later again named his Bulawayo, just like Shaga did before him. That's not very creative. And since they didn't come from the same family, why would they need to name their capital? I mean, specifically, why would Mziligazi name his capital after Shaga? Mziligazi's story, like all others, should be analyzed because African historians also say that he died in 1838 and not 1868. 1868 makes more sense because this is when his most trusted Induna, Wundawane, along with his heir, disappeared too, and this is also around the same time that the Indunas, a whole bunch of them, were purged, and British writers love to accuse Mziligazi of murdering them all. But when we factor in that these missionaries and agents were simply working to pacify mercenaries like Shaga and Muzirigazi and keep them cooperative until the British goals were one of stealing gold and land, at which point they were purged. We start to see a very different story. For example, Ushaga was murdered on September 22, 1828, less than a week after he signed off a large parcel of land along the Natal coast to Isaacs on September 18, 1828, who was one of the so-called white chiefs or British conquistadors. With Dingani and Pandey's help, these so-called white chiefs or British conquistadors had come to the conclusion that Ushaga had served his purpose. Mziligazi faced the same fate too in 1838. Once Mziligazi wore the skin of the Proto-Bantu king, he died in 1838. So between mid-1838 and 1854, nothing about the history of Zimbabwe is possibly true. Lobengula, at least the real one, who had already passed the age of 7 and was not born in 1838, 1836, 1846, or 1852. At this time, he was already herding goats, and this usually happened when a boy was between 8 and 12 years old. African history was written to suit British goals, and we start to see this when we use a critical lens and compare notes, and we find that ours are very different from what the British say happened. I hope this wasn't too much. I will cover the land grab, depopulation, and then more on Muzirikazi's complication in the next video. Thank you so much for watching. If you like this video, please like and subscribe. Thank you so much for everyone that supports our Ko-fi account. You make this research and these videos possible. I really appreciate your support. And if you would like to show your support for this channel and content, please give to our Ko-fi account. The link is in the description box. Thank you so much for watching.